picture the scene for a second. We're in the ancient Middle East. The heat of the desert is just pressing down. The air is thick. And on the horizon, this group of figures emerges from the dust.
Right.
They're unexpected travelers, and they're arriving at the tent of the prophet Ibrahim. Now, usually when we encounter a narrative like this in ancient scriptural texts, we've been conditioned to expect, a very specific kind of story.
Yeah, a fairy tale, basically.
Exactly.
Yeah.
We anticipate this simple morality tale, populated by one-dimensional good guys and bad guys, inevitably capped off with some supernatural miracle that defies all laws of physics. We just tend to view these texts through the lens of ancient folklore.
And that tendency to mythologize the text, it actually strips it of its actual utility. When we approach these narratives as purely supernatural events happening in this magical realm, we inadvertently distance ourselves from them. We put them in a glass case. But the source material we're examining today demands a radically different approach. We are looking at Surah Hud in the Quran, specifically Ayat 69 through 83, but, and this is key, we are doing so through the interpretive framework of Ghulam Ahmed Parwez.
Which is fascinating.
It really is. Parwez was a mid-20th century scholar who dedicated his life to stripping away centuries of Persianized mysticism and Neoplatonic philosophy that had kind of attached itself to Quranic exegesis over the years.
Right.
His project, particularly in works like his Lugat ul-Quran, was to return to the classical pre-Islamic Bedouin Arabic roots of the text.
Which fundamentally changes the genre of what we are reading. Like, if we use Parwez's rationalist framework, we aren't reading a fairy tale at all.
Not even close.
We are looking at a profound psychological and sociological study of the ethics of civilization. So our mission for this deep dive is to explore two contrasting trajectories that collide in this single narrative.
Two very different paths.
Exactly. These messengers arrive at Ibrahim's tent carrying two massive pieces of news. First, they bring the announcement of a miraculous birth, which represents the continuation of Ibrahim's legacy and, really, the building of a future civilization.
Arise.
Yes, arise. And second, they carry the decree of a sudden, catastrophic death, the total annihilation of the people of Sodom, the neighboring community of Prophet Lut. It is the ultimate juxtaposition of societal rise and civilizational collapse.
In the core tension, it starts with the very identity of these messengers. Traditional commentaries have almost unanimously viewed these figures purely as supernatural angels who descended from the heavens, completely bypassing human natural laws.
Right, the glowing beings with wings kind of image.
Exactly. But Parwez, however, he analyzes the original Arabic phrasing, the historical context of the Semitic world, and the sociology of the interaction, and he interprets them as strategic delegation.
But delegation, like humans.
Yeah. He posits that they were human envoys carrying out the divine law. Or, even if one were to maintain the view that they were celestial beings, Parwez argues that they took human form and bound themselves entirely to human sociology and physical laws.
Oh, that's a crucial distinction.
Right. Their interaction with Ibrahim and later with Lut is deeply grounded in statecraft, in tribal protocols, and human psychology. We're going to explore how societies rise through rational thought and structural integrity, and how they implode through structural rot, using Parwez's concept of social physics.
Social physics, I love that term. So let's step inside the tent and look at the actual encounter, starting with Ayat 69 through 73. The delegation arrives, and their first interaction with Ibrahim is the exchange of a single word, salam.
Salam.
Yeah. Ibrahim responds in kind. Then, adhering to this deep-rooted Semitic code of hospitality, he doesn't just offer them a resting place. He immediately goes and roasts a fatted calf.
Which is no small thing.
No, he prepares a massive, labor-intensive feast. But when he places the food before them, they do not reach for it. They sit there, their hands entirely motionless. And this creates a fascinating dissonance. To understand the psychological weight of this moment, we really need to dissect that initial greeting of salam, because in our modern usage, it's just a casual hello, right? A passing pleasantry.
Yeah, the linguistic root of salam, which is SLM, it carries a weight that modern usage has almost entirely eroded. Yeah. In the classical Quranic and Semitic framework, salam is an active, binding assurance.
Binding.
Yes, it is fundamentally a contract of mutual security. When an individual in the ancient desert environment said salam to a stranger, they were making a twofold declaration. The negative aspect of this declaration is basically, you are entirely safe from any harm, aggression, or treachery from me.
Okay, so I won't hurt you.
Right. But the positive aspect, which is so often overlooked, is I will actively be a source of your completion, your security, and your ongoing growth. It's a pledge of active peacemaking and protection.
Wow. So they have just exchanged a profound verbal contract. Ibrahim has offered his protection, and they've supposedly offered theirs. And then comes the roasted calf. Now, the traditional explanation for their refusal to eat is quite literal, right?
Oh.
They were angels. Angels don't possess human biology, and therefore they just don't consume physical food.
Which is the standard Sunday school answer.
Exactly. But Parwez's sociological reading shifts the focus from their biology to the cultural mechanics of the Arab and Semitic traditions.
Yeah, because the sharing of a meal in the ancient Near East, that was the ultimate pact of peace. It was the physical ratification of the verbal salam. You have to remember, the desert was an incredibly harsh, resource-scarce environment where tribal warfare was just constant. Trust was a rare commodity.
Well, you didn't just invite anyone in.
Exactly. If a guest entered a chieftain's tent and partook of their food, they were sharing sustenance, which symbolically intertwined their survival. So if a group of travelers enters your domain, exchanges a pledge of security, but then explicitly refuses to touch your food or drink your water, that is not a dietary quirk.
No.
In that cultural lexicon, it is an open, undeniable declaration of hostility. It communicates that the travelers consider the host an enemy, or at the very least, that they refuse to be bound by the obligations of peace that eating together would require.
That strikes me as a deeply tense geopolitical maneuver. It honestly reminds me of a high-stakes negotiation or like a mafia movie where a rival boss refuses the customary cup of espresso or something.
Exactly.
It immediately signals a breakdown in diplomacy, like we are not friends.
The text notes that upon seeing their hands hold back, Ibrahim felt an internal dread. The Arabic phrase used is ajasa kifatan.
Ajasa kifatan.
Yeah. It suggests a feeling of danger that is sensed intuitively, an unspoken apprehension that registers in the body before it even reaches the conscious mind. He reads the room, he sees the broken protocol, and he anticipates conflict. And his reaction is entirely logical for a patriarch who is responsible for the safety of his entire encampment. The messengers, observing this sudden shift in Ibrahim's demeanor, his transition from a gracious host to a defensive leader, they immediately move to de-escalate. They recognize the cultural miscommunication and they state, "Do not fear, we are sent to the people of Lut."
Oh, wow.
Yeah, in a single utterance, the scope of the danger completely shifts. The tension in the tent dissipates, but it's immediately replaced by a much larger civilizational dread. The hostility they are carrying isn't directed at Ibrahim's camp. It is a finalized decree against the neighboring city of Sodom.
Okay, so while Ibrahim is processing this massive geopolitical shift, the narrative pauses for a second to address his wife, Sarah, who is standing nearby. The delegation gives her the tidings that she's going to have a son, Ishaq, and eventually a grandson, Yaqub. And she is an elderly woman, long past childbearing age, and her reaction is one of absolute shock. The text frames her response as someone who just cannot fathom the biological possibility of this news. Now, if we're applying Parwez's rationalist framework, how does he interpret this event? Because it's really easy to view a postmenopausal pregnancy purely as a magical suspension of natural law.
It is. And Parwez tackles this by diving into the Quranic concept of Ayla.
Ayla.
Right, which means to restore, to amend, or to bring something back to its optimal state of functioning. He argues that the divine law operates through the physical laws of the universe, not in contradiction to them. So in his view, the glad tidings were accompanied by a process of biological revitalization.
So it wasn't just magic.
No, he posits that the divine law initiated a physiological restoration of her reproductive health. Whether this was achieved through an advanced, undiscovered application of natural physical laws or a psychological unblocking that triggered a physiological response, Parwez insists that it occurred within the framework of cause and effect. The text frames it as the divine restoring function to build a legacy, emphasizing that the birth of Ishaq was not some random anomaly, but a necessary step in establishing a lineage of rational leadership.
That sets up an incredible dichotomy in the tent. On one side, you have the restoration of life and the promise of a vast future legacy. And on the other side, the imminent, unavoidable destruction of an entire neighboring civilization.
Oh, it's heavy.
Yeah. Which brings us to Ibrahim's reaction to the news about Sodom, found in Ayat 74 through 76. Faced with the knowledge that a city is about to be wiped out, Ibrahim doesn't just bow his head and accept it, he initiates a debate. The text says he engages in mujadala. He actively argues and pleads with the messengers on behalf of Lut's people. He's trying to find a way to avert the disaster.
And this is a crucial moment for understanding the Quranic paradigm of leadership. The text does not reprimand Ibrahim for questioning the decree or for pushing back against the messengers. In fact, it validates his reaction by immediately describing the internal character traits that drove him to argue in the first place.
Right.
The Quran outlines the anatomy of a perfect leader using 3 distinct, deeply nuanced Arabic words: Halim, Awa, and Munib. And these terms are frequently misunderstood because later translations often filtered them through a lens of, well, passivity.
Let's break those down, starting with Halim, because the standard translations usually render this as forbearing, meek, or mild. That vocabulary paints a picture of a monastic figure, someone who is quiet, passive, and perhaps easily pushed around. It evokes that concept of turning the other cheek, regardless of the aggression faced.
Yeah, and Parwez argues that rendering Halim as meek is a severe linguistic distortion. To really understand Halim, we have to return to the classical desert imagery. The root word is associated with the specific developmental stage of a camel. A camel. Imagine a massive, fully grown, incredibly robust beast of burden. It possesses enough physical power to trample a tent or crush a person. When this camel is resting, children might run around it, pull at its harness, or dogs might yap incessantly at its heels. A weaker or more nervous animal would spook, bolt, or attack.
Right, it would freak out.
Exactly. But this powerful camel simply sits there, calmly chewing its cud, entirely unbothered. It does not react to petty annoyances because it is so secure in its own immense strength. Therefore, Halim does not mean weak. It means possessing formidable strength that is under absolute, ironclad emotional control. It is a leader who refuses to be provoked by the irrationality or petty hostility of others.
Okay, so Ibrahim is an unshakable foundation. He isn't reacting to the news out of panic or hysteria. His argument with the messengers is grounded and measured. The second trait described is Awa. If Halim is the mountain, what is Awa?
So Awa is the internal emotional landscape. It describes a heart that is filled with profound, almost painful empathy for humanity. The word itself phonetically mimics a sigh of pain or deep sorrow. Awa.
Oh, wow. Yeah, an individual who is Awa literally feels their chest ache when they witness the suffering of others. They're simply incapable of callousness. So within this unshakable, formidable mountain of a leader, the Halim, there beats a heart that bleeds for the well-being of people. That's the Awa. He is arguing for Sodom because his deep empathy cannot bear the thought of human destruction, even the destruction of a deeply flawed society.
Okay, I need to challenge this framework for a second because bringing those two traits together creates a significant operational tension. If Ibrahim possesses this boundless, aching empathy for humanity, how can he ultimately preside over, or at least accept, the absolute annihilation of a city?
It's a great question.
It seems contradictory, right? A leader driven purely by Awa would surely grant infinite chances, endlessly forgiving the transgressions of the corrupt just to avoid causing them harm. How does a framework of deep compassion reconcile with executing a death sentence on an entire society? That tension is precisely what the third trait, Munib, resolves. Munib is the anchor. It describes one who constantly turns back, who inevitably returns to a fixed point. In this context, it means returning to the ultimate objective standard of the divine law, or the universal law of requital. Parwez utilizes a very stark analogy to explain this interplay: the master surgeon and the judge.
Okay.
A master surgeon possesses both a soothing, healing ointment and a razor-sharp, dangerous scalpel. If the surgeon is driven solely by empathy and cannot bear the thought of cutting human flesh, they will only ever apply ointment. If a patient arrives with a malignant spreading tumor, the ointment will do absolutely nothing and the patient will die. Empathy alone becomes fatal.
Right. The surgeon must refer to the objective laws of medical science to determine when the scalpel is necessary, regardless of how unpleasant or bloody the surgery might be.
Exactly. The laws of medicine dictate the action. To further illustrate this, Parwez draws upon the historical record of Prophet Muhammad acting in his capacity as the chief judge of Medina. There was an incident where a man was found definitively guilty of a horrific premeditated murder. The societal law, the law of requital, demanded execution to maintain justice and social order.
Right.
The executioner was prepared. Suddenly, the young daughter of the convicted murderer rushed forward, weeping uncontrollably, throwing herself down, and begging the prophet to spare her father so she wouldn't be left an orphan. The historical accounts emphasize that the prophet was deeply moved. His eyes filled with tears and his heart broke for the child. He was profoundly awa.
But he didn't pardon the murderer.
He did not. His fingers still pointed to signal the execution. As a human being, his heart wept for the child's pain. But as a leader entrusted with the structural integrity of the society, his hand had to execute the objective law. He was Munib. If he allowed personal emotional sympathy to override the law of justice, he would be signaling that the law is arbitrary. The entire structure of societal trust and justice would collapse. A leader cannot let a murderer go free simply because the murderer has a grieving family. Doing so would be an act of profound injustice against the victim and the society at large.
That perfectly encapsulates the dynamic of Ibrahim's argument.
Yeah.
He utilized his empathy, his awa, to explore every possible avenue of mercy for Sodom. But the text indicates that the messengers eventually tell him to stop pleading. They inform him that the decree has been finalized because the people of Sodom have crossed a point of no return.
Exactly. The universal law of requital had already been triggered by their own actions.
And because Ibrahim is Munib, he recognizes that the objective law must take precedence over his personal empathy. He anchors himself to the inevitable. The philosopher Muhammad Iqbal used the metaphor of a honeybee to describe this, didn't he?
Yes. Iqbal's poetry beautifully captures the essence of Munib. A honeybee might fly miles away from its hive, exploring vast open fields, navigating complex terrain in search of nectar. It has a huge range of motion, but its internal navigation system is permanently locked onto the hive.
It always goes back.
Always. No matter how far it ranges, it inevitably, unerringly returns to its origin. Ibrahim's intellect and empathy allowed him to range far, debating and pleading for the city. But once the parameters of the divine law were clarified, his internal compass returned to the fixed point of objective justice. He accepted the reality that the society had engineered its own demise.
Wow. Let's examine the specific mechanics of that demise then. Because we are transitioning to the city of Sodom itself now, covered in Ayat 77 through 80. The delegation leaves Ibrahim's encampment and arrives at the city where Lut resides. The sociological rot of the city is exposed almost immediately upon their arrival. Lut is deeply distressed by the presence of these guests, not because he lacks hospitality, but because he knows exactly how his society will react to strangers.
He knows what's coming.
Yeah. And indeed, the people of the city, driven entirely by unbridled desires, form a mob and literally rush his house, intending to assault his guests.
And the ensuing confrontation at Lut's door contains one of the most heavily debated phrases in scriptural history. Lut steps out to face the mob. In the traditional English translations, which are heavily influenced by the biblical narrative found in Genesis 19, Lut attempts to placate the violent crowd by saying, "O my people, these are my daughters, they are pure for you."
And a literal reading of that translation is, well, it's deeply disturbing. It suggests that a prophet of God, a leader tasked with establishing morality, is actively offering his biological daughters to a violent, sexually aggressive mob to be violated, simply to protect the custom of guest right. It presents an impossible ethical paradox.
It's an ethical paradox that Parwez vehemently dismantles. He rejects this literal biological reading entirely, arguing that it completely ignores the linguistic idioms and the cultural reality of the ancient Semitic world. You have to remember, Lut was not merely a private citizen living in a suburban house. He was the elder, the prophet, and the patriarchal figure of that entire community.
Right.
In classical Semitic cultures, and actually this is a dynamic that still exists in many Eastern tribal societies today, an elder or a spiritual leader refers to all the young women of the society as my daughters and all the young men as my sons. It is an idiom of communal responsibility and endearment.
Okay. Similar to how a priest might address a congregation as my children, or an elder in a neighborhood might refer to the local youth as son or daughter. He is claiming sociological paternity, not biological paternity.
Precisely. Parwez clarifies that Lut was standing before a mob of men who had systematically abandoned natural, lawful societal relationships. They were engaging in unnatural acts of aggression, public indecency, and the violation of fundamental human rights in their open assemblies. Lut was pointing toward the women of their own community, my daughters, and pleading with the men to return to lawful, natural, marital relationships.
He's trying to ground them.
Yes, he was urging them to rebuild the foundational family structures that ensure societal continuity, rather than tearing the community apart through unchecked predatory aggression. He was calling for a return to structural normalcy.
And in the midst of this desperate plea, Lut screams a question at the mob that serves as the philosophical linchpin for this entire deep dive. He asks them, "Is there not among you one Rashid man?" The standard translation often renders this as right-minded or reasonable, but knowing Parwez's focus on classical Arabic, the word Rashid must carry a much deeper sociological weight. What exactly is a Rashid individual?
The root word is rushed, and it is an absolute cornerstone of Quranic sociology. Rush does not equate simply to raw intelligence or a high IQ or the ability to accumulate data. It refers to mature, rational thinking. It represents the perfect, calibrated synthesis of intellect and emotion.
It's a synthesis.
Yeah, an individual who possesses Rush has the capacity for logical foresight. They can observe an action, trace it through the complex chain of cause and effect, and accurately foresee the ultimate long-term outcome. They understand that actions are seeds that inevitably bear specific fruits.
Salute is not just giving them a moral lecture about their behavior in a vacuum. He is indicting their complete lack of logical foresight. He's essentially asking, can none of you do the math? Can none of you calculate the trajectory of where this behavior leads? He's pointing out that their actions are fundamentally unsustainable.
Exactly. And when an entire society loses its rush, the results are catastrophic. The Quran utilizes a very specific phrase to describe the people of Sodom. It says they were blindly wandering in their intoxication. Now, Parwez notes that this intoxication is not necessarily chemical.
Right.
They were intoxicated by their own desires, their own hubris, and the validation of their own echo chambers. When a society is drunk on its own momentum, it loses the ability to see the cliff edge it is rapidly approaching. They lose the capacity to connect their present actions to their future destruction.
The text also mentions that they had cut off the path, the Arabic phrase being kata al-sabil. Now, initially, that sounds like a reference to literal highway robbery, making the trade routes unsafe.
It includes highway robbery, yes, as they had made the physical roads treacherous, but Parwez insists the primary meaning is ideological and sociological. By abandoning natural familial structures, violently assaulting visitors, and institutionalizing predatory behavior, they were severing the very path of human continuation. They were cutting off the societal health required to produce a stable next generation.
Wow.
A society that functions solely on the fulfillment of immediate violent desires simply cannot sustain a future. They were, in the most literal sense, committing civilizational suicide.
If we abstract this concept of rushed, it becomes terrifyingly applicable to modern systems. Think about a massive corporation run by a board of executives who are entirely fixated on the next quarter's profit margins. They might gut their research and development, underpay their workforce, ignore environmental regulations just to secure immediate massive bonuses.
A perfect modern example.
Right. They are intoxicated by the short-term high of immediate wealth. They lack rushed because they cannot or will not see that their actions are destroying the company's long-term infrastructure. Or consider a political system that runs entirely on manufacturing outrage and dividing the populace for immediate electoral gains. It might work for one election cycle, but it destroys the social cohesion required for a functioning nation.
Those parallels are exact, and they lead us to a very stark sociological question. How does an honest, rational person, a Rashid individual, survive in a system that is entirely bereft of rush?
The historical evidence suggests they don't survive. They're either crushed by the system or they're forced out.
They are inevitably targeted for expulsion. Parwez highlights the bitter irony found elsewhere in the Quran regarding the mob's justification for banishing Lut. Did they accuse him of theft? Did they accuse him of violence or treason? No. Their explicit, stated reasoning for wanting to expel Lut and his followers was, expel them from your city, for they are people who keep themselves pure.
That rationale is fascinating. They didn't frame him as a threat because he was dangerous. They framed him as a threat specifically because he possessed integrity.
It is the ultimate diagnostic symptom of a dying system. A corrupt society, deeply invested in its own rot, cannot tolerate the presence of a pure, rational Rashid person. The honest person's mere existence is an indictment of the society. They function as a mirror reflecting the society's ugliness, and they act as a whistleblower simply by refusing to participate in the corruption. A society intoxicated by decay will always attempt to silence, marginalize, or expel the whistleblower to protect its illusion of stability.
Which fundamentally recontextualizes Lut's departure from the city. It wasn't an act of a frightened man fleeing in the night. It was a necessary ideological severing. The system had proven itself entirely unfixable. It was rejecting the cure. And this brings us to the actual mechanics of the escape, found in Ayat 81, which introduces a concept Parwez terms the Law of Association. The messengers instruct Lut that the period for negotiation and pleading is definitively over. The structural collapse is imminent. He is told to gather his people and leave the city in the dead of night. But, and this is a big but, there's a massive jarring caveat in this instruction.
The wife.
Yes, the wife. He is told to take his family, but his wife is explicitly left behind to face the impending annihilation. This is a point that requires serious friction. On the surface, this sounds incredibly callous. If she's married to a prophet, does that proximity not afford a protection? In almost every human tribal structure, family is protected above all else. Why is she abandoned to the destruction? Let's unpack that.
Well, if we apply standard human tribal logic, where bloodlines and marital contracts are the ultimate bonds, her abandonment makes no sense. But the Quranic worldview introduces a massive paradigm shift here. Parwez calls it the law of association. In this framework, your all your people, your family, your tribe is not defined by biological genetics, and it is not defined by legal marriage certificates. It is defined entirely and exclusively by ideological alignment.
Wait, so ideological alignment supersedes biological and marital bonds?
Absolutely. The Quran establishes this precedent earlier in the narrative of Prophet Nuh. Nuh attempts to save his biological son from the flood, pleading with the divine that his son is of his family. The response he receives is, "He's not of your family. Indeed, his conduct is other than righteous."
Oh, wow.
Yeah, the biological link is nullified by the ideological divergence. The same law applies to Lut's wife. She lived inside the prophet's house. She shared his meals. She had unparalleled proximity to a Rashid leader. But her internal worldview, her values, and her sympathies were entirely tethered to the failing, corrupt system of Sodom out in the streets.
She was physically in the house of reason, but psychologically in the house of rot.
That's a great way to put it.
The messengers give Lut and his followers one specific haunting instruction as they leave. Let none of you look back. Again, interpreting this through an ancient folklore lens, it sounds like a fairy tale curse. It evokes the Greek myth of Orpheus and Eurydice, where a physical turn of the head results in magical punishment, or the Sunday school version, where looking back literally turns you into a pillar of salt. How does Parwez's social physics interpret this command?
Parwez insists on a deeply psychological and sociological reading. The injunction, "let none of you look back," is not an arbitrary test of neck mobility. It is a profound warning against maintaining emotional or psychological sympathy for a destructive system. If you have recognized that a structure, be it a society, an institution, or a relationship, is fundamentally corrupt and doomed by the law of requital, you must sever your ties completely. You cannot leave your heart behind.
Because if you maintain sympathy for a rotting structure, you share in its collapse.
Exactly the point. Consider the physical analogy of a burning building. If you recognize the building is collapsing and you run out the door, but you continually look back, longing for the warmth of the fire, wishing you could stay inside, you will hesitate. You will remain within the blast radius. Psychologically, Lut's wife never truly left Sodom. She identified with its culture and sympathized with its people, even as they assaulted her husband's guests. Because she was ideologically tethered to the city, the law of association dictated that she shared its inevitable fate.
Applying this law of association to our contemporary reality forces a very uncomfortable self-audit. We all exist within various systems. We are tethered to corporate cultures, political parties, academic institutions, social networks. What happens if you are a generally good, honest person, but you inextricably tie your identity, your ego, and your livelihood to a system that fundamentally lacks rushed?
It's a dangerous game.
Right. Suppose you work for an organization where you know the ethics are entirely compromised, where the leadership makes predatory decisions, but you stay because the proximity to power or wealth is comfortable. Parwez is arguing that no amount of personal individual goodness will save you from the systemic collapse. You cannot be saved by proxy. If you are ideologically or financially tethered to the Titanic and you refuse to sever that tie, you are going down with the ship, regardless of how politely you treated the other passengers.
That is the harsh, unyielding reality of the law of requital. It does not operate on sentimentality, it operates on cause and effect. As Lut and his true ideological followers sever their ties and walk away into the darkness, a critical sociological threshold is crossed within the city. With the departure of Lut, the very last elements of Rush are removed from Sodom.
The final voices of mature, rational foresight are gone.
Yes. At that exact moment, the structural integrity of the society hits absolute zero. There is no longer any opposing force to the corruption. The total collapse is no longer just a potential future outcome, it becomes a physical inevitability.
Which brings us to the terrifying climax of the narrative, the absolute destruction of the city, detailed in Ayat 82 and 83. The Quran describes the event with a very specific evocative phrase. We made its highest part its lowest. The Arabic is Ja'ala aliyah safalaha.
Right.
Furthermore, it states that it rained upon them stones of baked clay, layer upon layer, marked by the divine law. Now, when we hear highest part its lowest, the traditional imagery is almost cartoonish-like. Angels physically lifting the tectonic plate and flipping the city over like a coin. But within Parwez's framework of social physics, this flipping is not just a description of physical ruin.
The physical flipping is the ultimate consequence, but Parwez emphasizes that before a city physically flips, it must first flip sociologically. Making the highest part its lowest is a profound metaphor for the reversal of social hierarchy.
Okay, unpack that.
Consider the architecture of a healthy, functioning society. What values does it elevate to the highest positions of influence and power? It elevates honesty, intellectual rigor, compassion, justice, and the protection of the vulnerable. These are the load-bearing pillars of civilization. Conversely, what does a healthy society keep at the lowest levels, marginalized and suppressed? It suppresses indecency, cruelty, robbery, exploitation, and the silencing of the truthful.
That is the structural design of a sustainable culture. The heavy, solid foundation is at the bottom, supporting the edifice.
Now, observe what happens when a society abandons Rush and becomes intoxicated by its own desires. The social hierarchy turns upside down. The society elevates the lowest, most toxic values to the highest positions of power. The corrupt, the predatory, and the deceitful become the celebrated leaders and culture makers. The violent become the enforcers of the new norm. And what happens to the honest, the pure, the Rashid individuals?
They're crushed.
They are pushed to the absolute bottom, marginalized, silenced, or expelled, exactly as Lut was.
Returning to the architectural analogy, it is the equivalent of a civil engineer deciding to place the massive, heavy concrete foundation on the roof of a skyscraper and using flimsy drywall for the ground floor. It defines the laws of physics. The structure cannot stand. Gravity will inevitably take it down.
Precisely. When a society makes its highest values its lowest and its lowest values its highest, it loses its sociological structural integrity. It implodes from within. And once it implodes sociologically, Parwez argues, the physical destruction is merely the final execution of the law of requital. The physical destruction of Sodom perfectly mirrors this law of gravity. Parwez, in his commentary, meticulously points out that the physical descriptions in the Quran, the turning upside down, the raining of baked clay stones, the sulfur align perfectly with the geological reality of the Dead Sea region where Sodom was located.
The geography of that region is fascinating. It sits on the Great Rift Valley, a massive, highly active tectonic fault line. Historically and geologically, it is known for violent seismic activity, earthquakes, and specific volcanic phenomena like pyroclastic flows.
Yes, the pyroclastic flows.
A pyroclastic flow is a terrifying, superheated cloud of dense gas and volcanic rock that erupts and rains down upon the surrounding area, like literal stones of fire and baked clay. The geography itself is a loaded weapon.
And this is where Parwez's synthesis of physical science and Quranic theology is most brilliant. He offers a critical insight. These natural disasters are not just random, meaningless geological hiccups. Within the Quranic worldview, the physical laws of nature act as the executioners of the law of requital. The text concludes the narrative of Sodom by stating that this punishment is not far from the wrongdoers. This phrasing is highly significant.
It bridges the gap between morality and geology. We're so conditioned in the modern era to view natural disasters purely as random events. A tectonic plate shifts, a fault line slips, and it is simply tragic luck for whoever happens to have built a city there. There's no moral dimension to a volcano. But the text demands that we recognize a direct connection between the ethical decay of a civilization and its ultimate physical vulnerability to collapse.
The connection lies in the concept of foresight. A society equipped with Rush. A society that retains its rational thinkers and values intellectual rigor builds resilient structures. They study the geography, they recognize the fault lines, they place their cities carefully, they engineer warning systems, and they prioritize the protection of their citizens.
Right.
But a society that has flipped sociologically, a society intoxicated by its own greed and the pursuit of immediate desires, becomes entirely blind to impending consequences. They ignore the rumbling of the volcano and the shifting of the fault lines because they are too distracted by their own excess. Their ethical rot guarantees their physical vulnerability. They position themselves perfectly to be annihilated when the physical laws of nature inevitably shift. The destruction is not arbitrary magic. It is the mathematical certainty of a society that ignored the physics of its own environment.
That is a staggering synthesis of theology, sociology, and earth science. It demands that we view our own societal structures with an entirely new level of scrutiny. Let's pull all of these massive concepts together, because we have charted a profound journey today through Parwez's framework. We began in the dusty heat outside Ibrahim's tent, witnessing the intersection of two distinct civilizational trajectories.
We observed Ibrahim, who embodied the absolute pinnacle of rational leadership. He possessed Halim, that immense, grounded, unbothered strength. He possessed Awa, a heart that ached with profound empathy for the human condition. Yet he governed these powerful internal forces with Munib, the anchor that constantly returned him to the objective standard of the universal law. Because he held these forces in perfect equilibrium, he was entrusted with the genesis of a new legacy, the birth of a lineage that would shape human history.
And tracing the opposite trajectory, we watched the catastrophic collapse of Sodom. We saw a civilization that systematically eradicated its own rusht, its capacity for mature, rational foresight. They became so intoxicated by their unbridled desires that they committed civilizational suicide, cutting off the very path to a sustainable future.
Total collapse.
Yeah, they couldn't tolerate the presence of the pure, so they expelled their whistleblowers. They inverted their social architecture, elevating their most toxic elements to the highest peaks of power while crushing integrity to the bottom. And by doing so, they triggered the law of requital. They engineered their own inescapable destruction, and the physical laws of the earth simply executed the final decree. And crucially, we learned the unforgiving nature of the law of association. Anyone who looked back, anyone who maintained ideological sympathy for the rot, was consumed by the collapse.
It is a stark, unyielding, and deeply necessary lesson in the ethics of civilization. But this exploration of social physics doesn't end in the ashes of the Dead Sea. Parwez's sequential analysis of Surah Hud reveals that societal collapse takes many forms.
Indeed, this is only one chapter in a much larger thesis. In our next deep dive into this source material, we will be moving sequentially into Ayat 84 through 95. And if you're listening to this and you found the psychological and social implosion of Sodom relevant to our contemporary world, the next narrative is going to feel incredibly prescient.
We'll transition from the social and ethical rot of Sodom to the systemic economic rot of Madian. Prophet Shu'aib will arrive as the voice of Rusht to confront a society whose fatal structural flaw is defined by the phrase shortchanging the weights and measures. We will be dissecting the ethics of commerce, the mechanics of structural inequality, and the inevitable destructive consequences of unrestrained, predatory capitalism.
It is going to be an intense examination of how economic injustice triggers the exact same law of requital that volcanic fault lines do. As we wrap up today's exploration, I want to leave you with a final, lingering thought to process. We've spent an hour dissecting the structural integrity of ancient societies, observing the warning signs of their collapse. But the Quranic text isn't a history book. It is a mirror.
A mirror, yes.
When you examine the various systems you are tethered to right now, the corporate hierarchy you work within, the political parties you support, the social institutions you fund, and the cultural movements you amplify, ask yourself, who are the Rashid individuals in those spaces? Who are the voices of mature, rational foresight, the ones demanding long-term ethical sustainability over short-term gratification? And more importantly, observe how your system treats those voices. If you realize that the Rashid are being ignored, silenced, or actively pushed out because they are deemed an annoyance to the system's momentum, well, what does that tell you about the true structural integrity of the city you are living in? Keep your eyes open to the architecture around you. And whatever you do, do not look back.